Now we'll start with the committee, and as I said, our custom is always to start with our guests. So, Mohammed, please.
Thank you. Is there a time limit, or how you want to do that?
I kept to my time limit.
That's what I'm trying to understand. 10 minutes, 5 minutes for a question.
You have to be satisfied enough to put your signature on the cover.
All right. Thank you. Well, as I said in my feedback to you, Maneshka, several weeks ago, I think you have an excellent sort of first draft in terms of both presenting the literature as well as the findings and the different, I think, different new aspects that you bring into the story here. I particularly like the way you weaved into your findings and your interviews and your qualitative data and link it a little bit with the literature. I found that to be sort of a strong aspect of it. And I've suggested for you about 6 or 7 other points at that point to look at them. So what I'm going to do here, probably raise some questions. Part of it is really to push the envelope a little bit and make this as a defense. And the second is more for sort of my interest and maybe food for thought for you in terms of your next step. So if I was like an outsider and reading this dissertation, probably one of the first questions that I would ask would be, what would you think and starting from the last point that you did, you said this is a generic model, the DDR. What would you say the unique tactics that the LTT have used to recruit women and not necessarily men? Because we know the LTT recruited in 3 waves, men and women, for about 25 or 30 years. So what is it unique? Because most of the explanation, structural, individual, as well as the cultural, can really be easily and have been used by various scholars and researchers in Sri Lanka to explain how come the LTT is effective in recruiting men, women, and children. So what is it that's special in it? I mean, you mentioned propaganda, you mentioned several of these categories, but none of them really went into details, and I know you go into some of them, that makes it appealing to a woman. That's something I think would make it unique. Should we go question by question, or should they say them?
We should have another question.
Okay. That's one thing I'm interested in looking at it. Another core issue, you presented the whole thing as it's bad to fight with the LTT. And for somebody who comes from political science and one also who's a true supporter of LTT, who would look at this as a liberation movement. I mean, this is the Eelam liberation movement. Why fighting, whether men or women, is something bad that I have to defend? Of course, I lost my battle in the last one, but this is only temporary. And this is a battle, not the war necessarily. The whole premise of the dissertation, that it was wrong for the women to fight for their cause, and they made a mistake. Whether it is suicide bomber or whether it is a soldier. The same argument can be also made to the men who also fought. And with the interview of 22, you probably did not find, unless you did not report that, one who continued to say, yeah, I think you mentioned maybe one of them said, I don't regret fighting, and this is something that I would do it again. And yeah. So that story is not presented, at least as much in the dissertation. Definitely it didn't come through in the presentation here. The notion that fighting for the cause of liberating East and North for the self-determination of the Tamil people is legitimate, and that the government of Sri Lanka for 50 or 60 years have systematically oppressed men and women and children, and everyone in the society is responsible to take a little bit of the burden of the struggle, rather than labeling them as very bad, we need to fix them.
May I take this to question?
I think you better.
Thank you. All right. To respond, thank you, Mohammed. Those were excellent questions. To respond to the first question, what is unique about the LTTE as far as recruiting females? The LTTE, while initially being a group of boys and men, once they found that the women were, in 1983, the women asked for a female wing to be created. And once they realized that this could be a source of manpower for them, the LTTE started using the whole idea that women are oppressed by Tamil culture. This is a way for us to help you liberate from your own culture. This is a way for us to help you earn a new position in society. You can be frontline fighters, you can drive tanks. The LTTE, who even had a miniature air force, had female fighter pilots. So women really went on to do everything that the men did. And so that was really one of their main pull factors. Several women said to me, I liked the uniform, I liked to be able to fight just like the men. And I said, wow, that's interesting, that you want to be able to be just like the men on the battlefront. And these are women who, in the north and the east of Sri Lanka, Mohammed, you know better than I, those women traditionally wouldn't have gone to school beyond the age of 12. Some of them. For the most part in the Vani, they would not have gone to school beyond the age of 12. So this really provided them a space to expand their own horizons. And they really rose to the occasion. To go on to the second question, I agree that the Sri Lankan state has oppressed the Tamil people. Having suffered that oppression myself, I completely understand it. However, the LTTE was not the liberator of the Tamil people. They oppressed the Tamil people as much as the Sri Lankan government. And so it's very difficult to say that the violence that was adopted by the LTTE was legitimate. In fact, there are many ways, as we know, through nonviolent struggle that you can achieve societal and structural change, which the LTTE repeatedly showed that they were not willing to do. At least among the top-level hierarchy. I think that certainly the political faction of the LTTE might have been willing to do it, but this is why it's so important for us to understand the psyche of the leader of the LTTE itself and how he controlled the organization. Was it really an egalitarian organization, or was it a one-man show? So as far as are there grievances legitimate? Absolutely, they're legitimate. And the grievances that they had 30 years ago live even today. And this might be a temporary hiatus in their fighting, in fact. In fact, if we don't do something to change the structure for these men and women, there could be violence again in 5 years. Their living conditions are abysmal. They have no running water. They have no roof over their head. Most of them live under blue tents that have been provided by UNDP 34 months after the war ended. There is some clearing of landmines that has taken place, but children don't get to go to school because the school, it's not conditions that are conducive.
Okay, can you speak more towards this issue of, do you see those women in the conversation, in the interviews?
I do.
Have they spoken about the fact that they believed in the cause of liberation, and rather than as it is presented here, it's a mistake that they have done and now they are being rehabbed.
No. It's they are very clearly they were fighting for the cause of the LTTE for liberation, and they were fighting for at once the LTTE liberation as well as for women's liberation. And there was this one instance where a grandmother was holding the granddaughter who was maybe 2 years old, and the child starts climbing this fence, and the grandmother turns around to me and says, "Look, she's training to be a fighter." And that moment was really eye-opening for me, because I realized their fight isn't over yet. This is just a hiatus. And if the Sri Lankan government, the world community, does not do something to help these people in their goals for community, their goals to be able to live as equals in that land, their grievances are not going to go away.
I'll go to the next component, which is the culture. You mentioned in several times, actually, now in your response as well, that the patriarchal culture of and the hierarchy in the Tamil. I mean, one thing I would be a little bit more careful about that. So I would qualify it a little bit more, because you know that certain Tamil women live in urban area in Colombo and others. And even in Batiklo and other areas, or Kandy even for that matter, they don't necessarily abide by this cultural description that you used to describe. Almost sounded like all Tamil women, but I'm sure you did not intend that, and you qualified it with Eastern and North, but I would go even to qualify it further, because this also could be like the LTTE tried to portray the cultural oppression of women as a tool for recruitment, and what, you know, we don't want to have the same argument here, to say the least. But in the culture, I want to go to the other part. So in your interviews with those 22 key informants, and also in your analysis, can you think of a cultural traits, norms, values, rituals, whatever it is that compose the cultural definition that you want to use, that can be helpful in the rehab, in the next phase, in the DDR? Because if culture is an oppressive tool, also many cultures will have in them some components that will help in the conflict resolution part and the reconciliation part. Have you given a thought to that aspect?
I have given some thought to it. I want to go back to your first comment, though, if you don't mind, about Tamil women. I'm not homogenizing Tamil women. I'm very cognizant of the difference between the urban Tamil woman, I am an urban Tamil woman, and the rural Tamil woman, specifically the rural Tamil woman in the Vani. There is a huge distinction between the urban Tamil woman and the rural Tamil woman in the Vani. In fact, the Tesavalami law is limited to the northern province.
Yeah, to a very small community, relatively.
Well, the Velala, the upper caste usually use it to deny the lower caste people their rightful place in society. And as I said, many of the thousands of women that emerged in combat were from the Vani region. So my use of the Tamil culture is really specific to the Tamil women of the Vani. And as far as does the Tamil culture itself have conflict resolution mechanisms that we can use? Yes, in fact, the Tamil culture prior to the establishment of the LTTE, they would use satyagraha as a mode of trying to change the structure. the Bandaranayaka Chelvanayagam Act, which I speak about in my dissertation, is a direct consequence of those satyagraha, of that nonviolence resistance. So there were openings for there are openings in the Tamil culture for this, in the Hindu culture as well as the Christian culture. We also see that during the wartime, and I've written about this in my book with Sandy, during the wartime, the Catholic Church acted as a conduit for peace building, because there are Catholics in both the Sinhalese culture as well as the Tamil culture. So the Catholic Church was a common ground for them. So there are various different ways that we can explore conflict resolution from traditional Sri Lankan mechanisms. And then also, lastly, both the Tamil Hindus as well as the Buddhist Sinhalese, they worship some of the same temples. And that has really not been explored very much. The Murugan temple in Kataragama is a place of common worship for these people, which could really be explored further in conflict resolution.
Thank you. Another point that I've had regarding the methodology, how would you respond to the question that it's only 22 key informants that you did not even, maybe you want to tell more about how did you select them, why these specifically, who recommended for them, and why do you think the story that they told you is the story rather than a story? Because we have hundreds, if not thousands, of women who were involved in the LTTE in 40 years, and those are very specific one you found in a DDR's institution controlled by the army, and the army rifle is on the head, so they might not really say much about the old days. So how would you justify that this is the story rather than a story?
Well, my research at the Puntottam Rehabilitation Center was the second lot of interviews that I carried out. The first group of interviews that I carried out was in the natural setting of Malawi Tunukai, in the 23 villages itself. And those interviews were, I've met with these women over 3 years now, working with them in program development. And so when I asked, are there any former female combatants in this area, I had been speaking with them for some time. Many had been through I chose to only interview those women that had gone through the DDR process, because I did not want to jeopardize the identity of those women that had not gone through the DDR process. I did not want to violate their trust. So I chose to speak with women who had gone through the DDR process. But as I said, many of them go through training in how to sew and how to do beauty culture. There is no trauma healing, there is no reconciliation as far as I can tell that's being done with them. They still hold on very tightly to their identities as combatants, as fighters, and of wanting a life for their families. They might be wary of war right now, but I'm not sure how long they will be wary of that war. So my main interviews were carried out in Malawi Tunukai, in the Divisional Secretariat of Malawi Tunukai. And so while I only carried out 22 interviews with the women, I also carried out interviews among the men. And then I've been speaking with the villages, with hundreds of villages over the years. So I had an understanding of some of what these women were, whether their stories comport or not.
My final note is this smaller one and on a different level. One is that we were invited to the Sri Lanka government meeting with the World Bank and USAID in Colombo in the embassy.
Today? I mean, recently?
No, next week you will be invited.
Oh, I will be. Okay.
Yes, and you're asked as an advisor who done about 400 pages on the issue of women and the LTT and the DDR to give a talk for about 1 minute. So what would be your main point that you would convey to those people meeting next week?
Well, that the women need to be given community building and community development that is targeted towards their aspirations, towards what the women want, what are the tools that they have, what is the education that they have. You cannot take someone that was a medic, someone that was a truck driver, and ask her to go and become a beautician. So their education needs to be tailored to their already existent knowledge and what their aspirations are for themselves as well as their communities that they come from. And then lastly, reconciliation is a huge component, and I don't see this happening at all in Sri Lanka. It's almost taboo to talk about reconciliation, and that we need to create a space for reconciliation, especially for these women, because they're the ones who are going to then tell these stories to their children and their children's children, and we don't want transgenerational trauma to be passed down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. A real demonstration of the incredible importance to the integrity of the process of the outside. Thank you for playing that role. Sandra.
I keep forgetting you're outside.
I've been labeled as an outsider for the last 3 weeks, but I'm insider partial.
First he was an honored guest after those questions.
Those questions are great, and I'm actually going to try to build on some of the questions because they relate very closely. My questions are quite diverse, so let me start with one. Maybe you could get up the triangles of your three phases. 3 waves, I think is what you call them. Yeah. This is an interesting phenomenon that I don't think is unique to Sri Lanka, but this gets at the question that I have about the gendered nature of what's happened with the tigers. And so as I read this and tried to make sense out of your framework here, it looks like a very sad story that here are women who have demonstrated in every possible way that they are equal partners, and in that second wave it really plays itself out. And then it's like what happens with Eritrea, or even here in the US after World War II, where, okay, thank you very much for your services, we don't need them anymore, please go back and behave yourself. So what is the gendered story of the post-wave 3?
That's a very important question. Thank you, Sandy. It's very interesting how Sri Lankan society, both at the government level as well as at the traditional Tamil cultural level, have now expected the women to return to their roles as the good daughter, the good mother, the good wife. And there was a marked departure from that role during the war. But we see women they're now accompanied by their male family members when they leave the home, especially in the Vani. That, of course, is not limited to the Vani, Mohammed. Even I was accompanied by a male family member. Even to this day, I would be. That is something that is traditional to Tamil culture. And women are, by their being given these skills in sewing, skills in beauty culture, women are wondering, well, what do we do next? Where, is there a role for us in society? Some of them are not, especially in the East, right after the breakaway of the Karuna faction, there was a backlash against especially the girl child soldiers who tried to go back to school, and because they had very short hair, and in traditional Tamil cultures, traditional to have long hair, the short-haired children, there was stigma associated with this, and even school teachers would shun these young girls. And so the question is, how do we try to incorporate them and give them the agency that they were able to gain? One is by asking them what are their aspirations, what, you know, assessing what are the tools that they have. If they were medics that were doing amputations on the battlefront, then they have some kind of medical training. You know, one of the girls I interviewed said, during the final battles, I did about 250 amputations. I mean, this is a young woman, maybe 21 years old, who should never have seen battle, leave alone have to do amputations without any anesthesia, without any, you know, but she did it, and she has this skill. And I met some of her patients who were also combatants. So, you know, not expecting her to now pick up a cloth and sew garments, but to give her the tools. She said, I want to become a nurse, was what she said to me. So there are many like that.
Okay, another question that I have is really, if you take reflective practice seriously, particularly as a researcher, when I read this, I was troubled and encouraged at the same time about the fact that you were one of us, which complicates data collection, because they might very well be having an identification with you and then telling a story to you that may not be the same story they would tell to me, since I'm not one of us. And so it goes back to your question about kind of the legitimacy of the story. So the question I have for you is, now that you've gone through this process as a researcher and a self-proclaimed field practitioner, what lessons did you learn about the complications and what works around getting this kind of data in the interviews? And what would you advise to other self-proclaimed field practitioners who are going to try to get narratives that inform what would be next to prevent this just being an impasse of a war that's going to start in the next generation?
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Firstly, as I was doing the research to go to the field, but also understanding the culture that I was going to do this research, I knew, and from consultations with Kevin, yourself, and Mohammed, I knew that I could not go into the Vani and administer a survey. That would not have got me the data that is required for a qualitative study like this. And the women would not have given me the data. They would have said, sorry, we're not going to participate in this. Part of why they opened up to me is in the region of Malawi, Kunukai, we found out that in February we are the only NGO, and I was the only researcher that had gone into the Vani region in the 34 months since the war ended. The IOM has been there just after these people were returned from the IDP camps, and the World Food Program had been there for about 3 months after that. But since then, they've not had anyone there with them. So there was a hunger to be able to tell their story, not only about their war story, but what are their aspirations. There was a lot. So this is why it was impossible for me to come out of there just telling their war story. I had to tell you and the reader what their aspirations are as well. And that is where my practice comes in, is that I'm not purely a researcher, I'm also a practitioner. So I had to think about, I had to don my practitioner hat, and I had to ask, okay, so as a practitioner, what would I do to take their aspirations and develop a strategy for helping them move forward? And this is why Chapter 9 is where I leave off with some of my suggestions for providing them nonviolent ways of being able to change the violent structure, providing them nonviolent alternatives, providing them the education as well as the development that is direly needed. Many of these women are without limbs, without eyes. They need special resources which are not available in those villages that don't have basic amenities.
Okay, I have one more question. There were 3 groups in your sample. There was the volunteers, the combatants, and the medics. Was the sense of victimhood, did you notice, what's the question would be, their own sense of victimhood and using this as a platform, was it the same with all 3 groups? Was it?
That's a really interesting question. I found that victimhood was a thread that ran through all of the groups. Even those that had been coerced into the LTTE talked about victimhood on the part of the state. They were, and of course, many talked about the Indian peacekeeping force as really the worst brutalizer. When they talk about the Indian peacekeeping force, their stories are worse than what they had to say about the Sri Lankan military. Although, I think they're pretty. The Sri Lankan military was pretty ruthless. And so, yes, I would say that victimhood is a thread that runs through the entire group. Yeah. Okay.
So the identity doesn't matter what your job is in the war. It is the identification of the cause.
Yes, it is the identification of the cause. Also, we have to remember that with the LTTE, especially between 1983 and 2003, and I mentioned this in the dissertation, the women were allowed to choose their vocation. Yeah. So, they could be combat fighters for several years, then they could come back and be medics or truck drivers or school teachers for another several years, because the LTTE had both the combat forces, the political arm, as well as a civil administration. They had a standing judiciary, a standing police force. They lived like we would in Arlington County.
Probably not quite.
Well, not quite, right. But
okay. On that note.
Thank you. So a chair, if he or she, but in this case he, does his job right, then all of the really hard questions had to have been asked before. But I have.
Okay.
So further, let me reflect on Mohammed's first question, which of course is how you framed the whole dissertation, and it goes further than the old canard. It wasn't a canard in 1978. The old canard now that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Because I think if I understood him, Mohammed was really asking something more cutting, and that is really about the legitimacy of violence at all in these kinds of struggles for liberation or struggles against oppression. And we all have to take a kind of normative or prescriptive starting point, our Archimedean point about this. And for most of us in the field, the starting point is that violence is bad for women and children and men and young people and old people, and that conflicts can be processed in ways that don't extol or glorify violence. And once a conflict has been polluted by violence, then it's hard not to pathologize it. Not entirely, but it's hard not to. because the alternative is to glorify it or fetishize it or romanticize it. So there are certainly eloquent voices on the side of romanticizing and glorifying it, and there are eloquent voices on the other side, but my sense is that without pathologizing it, you very much took the baseline position that that having been immersed in this violence, both as victims and as perpetrators, something had to be done to address it.
Yeah, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You know, Mahatma Gandhi was called a terrorist. However, he did not use some of the same terror tactics that were used by the LTTE. My stand on the violence that the LTTE used is twofold. It is, they used violence on the Tamil people first, during their first few years of existence. They assassinated most of the Tamil politicians in the north of the country to be able to really claim their stake as the representatives of the Tamil people. So they violated their own people before they began targeting the Sri Lankan Sinhalese dominated structure. And so this is why it is difficult for me to say that the LTTE was altruistic in their in what they did. Now, much of what they did was based on legitimate grievance. However, the violence was not the only option. As we've seen with the Arab Spring recently, that we don't necessarily need to resort to violence in the way that the LTTE did to change a structure. And were all those thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives worth it? Is the question that I ask at the end of the day. I see the violence that they live in even today.
But sorry, the violence is from the Sri Lankan government. This is a typical, I think, argument about characterizing the liberation movements as the one who generate the violence. But the liberation movement, if I was a woman fighting in this, and I'm not, fighting with this group, I would say we were responding to the Sri Lankan government violent oppression,
right.
And what we use is a self-defense. So when you come and describe us as terrorists, that really delegitimize not only the objective, the goals, but also the means. And I think outsider will interrupt. It's okay.
No, but you aren't listening to all of the violence that the Tigers imposed on their own people.
Yeah, but so
the violence pervaded the entire social.
Yeah, but you like us to have a liberation movement as comfortable to you as a majority. We have our means to establish our unity.
That's right. But so that leads me to clearly Mohammed and I will frame this differently. But that leads me to my next comment, really, which is this is not the dissertation that you did, so this is not a critique, but I think one of the interesting questions that this raises is what are the effects of violence, which is not really what you were looking at. You were looking more at the precursors of violence, but not at what the effects of violence are. And you know, violence in some moral frameworks or political frameworks can both purify, you know, the purification of the sacrificial fire, and it can pollute. And that's true of lots of cultures. I mean, that's how we treat male veterans coming back from our wars. The figure of Rambo and the demented and psychopathic veteran who did these terrible things is something very strong. And that's for males too. But in the case of women, where the violence is gendered, it's really doubly polluting. Right? So it's not just a pollution of males who engaged in violence, but it's a double pollution, especially in the South Asian context, where pollution means something.
Right.
That it's women too. So it's a way of thinking about why, when these women are put back into traditional Tamil patriarchal society with their short hair and their missing limbs from combat, they are, in some sense, as much likely to be oppressed by their own Tamil culture as anything else. A comment and then a question. The comment is you have a real opportunity here, I think, and you actually alluded to it. You have a real opportunity to treat this exploratory study longitudinally. That is, what happens to these women 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And that's a way of getting at what are the effects of violence on them. And also what happens when they become mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers themselves. I was in Sri Lanka just a few months after the war ended, not the violence, after the war ended, and the triumphalism of the Sri Lankan government was just palpable. And I thought if there was a window that would be open to any form of reconciliation, it was rapidly closing, and everything you've said kind of indicated that. So my question, though, brings us, because I know that all three of us pressed you a little bit to talk about DDR and what are the practice implications, but I want to bring it back to theory and the connection of theory to your findings, but also the connection of theory to the practical implications for DDR, DDRR. So you rely upon three main theorists. You rely upon Veena Das, who has written from a South Asian and a gender perspective about violence, particularly violence on the female body, and on the notion of social violence and social trauma. And Vamik Volkin, who takes a psychoanalytic perspective and tries to look at the effects of violence as it's symbolized in these chosen traumas and passed on through the generations. And then Lonnie Athens, this criminologist whose work really was not about these kinds of movements at all. It was about how a violent criminal is made, mostly in a social, symbolic interaction is framework. So you use them in the dissertation, but you never really integrate them fully. This is more a comment about the book, I think, rather than the dissertation. So you never really integrate them fully so that the three related but different theoretical strands help you explain these women. So the question that I want to pose to you is different, which is thinking for a moment about what each of these three approaches to violence and trauma and violentization tell us. How would you, if you could integrate them, if you could think about integrating theory into practice, if you could integrate one or two or three of them into a DDR process, into what you would tell the Sri Lankan government? Because clearly one thing is these women were battlefield medics. They're not going to become tailors very, very easily. And these women were characterologically changed, and that has to be attended to. But what in particular, from the theoretical base that you use to conceptualize the research, could you bring into the other end, the practice end, the DDR?
Thank you, Kevin, for that question. With regards to Veena Das, I would, if I were recommending something to the Sri Lankan government or the international community, it would be the idea that reconciliation needs to take place and trauma healing needs to take place in order to prevent the body from being used as a platform for grieving, because their trauma is currently being bottled up. It's clear that their trauma is bottled up. Some of the women that I spoke with had clear pain in the stories that they told, in the untold story as well in their body language. And I'm certainly not a psychologist, and so I cannot address that, but I believe that trauma healing is a crucial component for these women, for the Sri Lankan people in general, especially those in the north who were, and the Vani, who were really affected the worst during the final years of the war. So using Veena Das' work to show how trauma healing is necessary. With Vedic Vulcan, I truly believe that transgenerational trauma did occur in the case of Sri Lanka, and that there is still, just as Mohammed says, there is still the chosen trauma of the minority people, the Muslim as well as the Tamil. The Dutch workers have for the most part left the country. So there needs to be reconciliation between the groups that needs to take place, and there is opportunity for it to take place, but it has not been embraced by the structure. And there does not seem to be any emphasis on this at the level of the international community either. As far as Lonnie Athens' theory goes, we see today that a large number of, especially the returning men, are resorting to alcoholism and other forms of violence. About 4 days before I entered the Vandi, a woman had been gang raped and she had committed suicide. And that is, for me, it raises red flags of a very traumatized society. And so even alcoholism is using the body as a platform.
Anything else from committee? Well, we have some time, so I'm happy to invite some questions or comments from the floor. I saw Susan, Al, and Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you, Maneshka. I really enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to ask if you could look at the three narratives that you cited in, I think, in your literature review. In one of the very, very early slides, you reviewed kind of, there have been these three different narratives of the women engaged in violence, or ways of treating women engaged in violence. And how would you situate your work?
Oh no, these are the three storylines that are dominant, and so my storyline is an alternative to these three, is that there are women with agency. Women's agency is something that we cannot ignore in the canvas that is the war canvas.
Thank you. Andre?
I wanted to push a little bit on this idea of agency as associated with military intervention. One, because I think that there is a lot of agency in doing whatever you do. It's not just by breaking with what is current that there is agency. Two, because the LTTE was an alternative to the status quo, but was extremely, as you mentioned several times, actually quite constraining. So you had a lot of loss of agency just because you had a change in roles. But you were actually acquiring very different roles and very different conditions. So you were changing in a way because the system was changing. So you have a different ideology, you have a modernization process, you have a very interesting equality idea, you have very different set of references, and therefore there is not necessarily agency for the single woman or for the person that is in that camp. It's like saying, well, there is a lot of agency for somebody coming to the United States. Well, there is an agency in the sense that I can come to this country, but then there is so much in the culture in which I am that has nothing to do with my agency. It's just that I am in a completely different system. So in that sense, I would be careful about linking it too much and too narrowly, because it will in a way undermine your attempt, if I understand it correctly, to regain nonviolence as a possible alternative, because nonviolence then is lost. If agency is, getting into the LTTE and participating in this, then how happened that is nonviolence, presented and proposed and so on. So then clearly there must be agency in all the different configurations, and it's important to keep an eye critically on the idea that an hyper-modernization can actually be very constraining. We have example, communist Soviet Union, in China, in Cambodia, you had tremendous change in which women clearly had different roles. If you compare the traditional system as the one, but you also have loss of it. So.
Right. As far as your question about how does it work with nonviolence, well, the school of nonviolence that I come from is Martin Luther King School of Nonviolence, and in Kingian nonviolence, the nonviolence is in fact the ability for one to have the potential to achieve one's goals. So that agency is built into that nonviolence lifestyle. So nonviolence, I think, is the perfect tool, in fact, for agency. It is the tool that allows every individual, no matter what age, no matter what gender, no matter what caste or class they come from, to have agency.
Thank you. I think I saw Chris Mitchell's hand. Chris?
Maneshka, you said you've interviewed 22 key informants who have been traumatized and who have joined the LTTE in some way, shape or form.
Yes, sir.
Did I understand? Do you think about interviewing somebody, a couple of people, 3, 4, who have been traumatized but who hadn't joined the LTTE?
I did. I did speak with many villagers who had not joined the LTTE, and they had several reasons for it. Some of the women said they didn't join because they had children, their husbands were in the LTTE, and so they stayed home to take care of their children. And this is an important point, Chris, because many women, despite having husbands at war, decided to join the combat ranks, leaving their children at the orphanages that the LTTE ran, the Sancholai, or even if there was a grandmother or an aunt, they would leave the children with. But some women opted not to. And then towards the last 8 years of the war, Chris, most families had really were reluctant to give their children, their young women and men to the war. And my hypothesis is that they saw something different. They saw the opportunity for nonviolence during the ceasefire. And their eyes were open to an alternative other than violence.
Okay, thanks.
So,
yeah, fascinating presentation, and I think your access is remarkable. And I was thinking about something afield from the dissertation a bit, but it was what you might learn in the future and what you might be able to say as an expert now in this area, which is and I think it relates to Mohammed's question, some of the other things that came up as well, which is thinking of this as a liberation movement and one that didn't go all that well.
Yeah.
And I think you're pointing to the fact that the brutalization of one's own people, the use of violence and what have you, even with the seeds of satyagraha being there to be used. So let's imagine women's use in liberation movements and violent conflicts, but as a strategic resource. And imagine that there are ways that one can use women symbolically as well. I mean, that there are as a kind of strategic resource, you can use them as a military resource, which was done here, or as a communicative resource. And it seems to me that if you go the nonviolent route, which seems that strategically this movement wasn't going to do, but is there some reason to suspect that there is a better use of women in liberation movements than in this kind of capacity? Is that part of what motivates what your study was about? If that makes sense, I can reframe it.
I think I will, Solon, if I may reframe it, because I try not to use the terms the use of women, because I want to give women their own their ability to make their own decisions, to have
But
their
the use of men, I'm thinking this is leadership position. I mean, the men are being used as well as one of these.
Right, and if the women opt for nonviolent ways of being agents of change, there are certainly plenty of opportunities for them. The mothers movement in Sri Lanka, mothers from both the Sinhalese and the former LTTE side who had lost sons in battle, who had come together, really were the impetus towards the ceasefire in 2001. They really paved the way for the ceasefire. It was the mothers who said, no other mother shall suffer this pain. So they did use their agency. So there were alternative structures, there were alternative ways. And certainly in this day and age, we've seen how women's movements all over the world are coming up, even in the most dire of circumstances. So there certainly are other ways that these women can exercise their agency.
And was let's say the lack of that engagement, with that agency and the potential symbolic engagement, part of what helped to explain why this movement had played out the way it did?
It is, so that I believe it's too soon for me to tell that. Because I think my study would have to encompass a lot more of the population, both the men and the women, not only in the Bani. I was targeting specifically the combatants, but this study would need to encompass the population in general of all of the northern province and all of the eastern province. And if someone would give me a nice big grant to do that, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you for such a great presentation, Dr. Eliatamby. You said a couple things that triggered my... Did I say the name?
You shouldn't have said that.
You said a couple things, and you said how the structure itself disables women's agency, and you said your solution, one of the solutions, was to really trigger their aspirations and what they want to do to take what they pretty much are holding on to as agency and as in their identity and freedom as a woman and channel it to, I guess, what they are able to do in today's society. Politics in general are changing, in my opinion. I mean, we see that in the Arab Spring. But in a patriarchal society where they're pretty much disabled and the structure itself are oppressing them further, what's your solution to changing that structure? And I know you showed a couple of models, but to really, I guess, aid in those aspirations that they really haven't let go, technically.
Right.
You know, they're not able to let go.
Thank you, Aya. Aya was one of my students and a colleague now. Thank you, Aya. You know, Sri Lanka is interesting. Many of you may not realize this, but in 1960, Sri Lanka had the first female elected as head of state in the world. She came from the Sinhalese population. And in the same country, you have another group of women that are governed by Kesavalame law. Firstly, there would need to be a multi-pronged approach to working on this issue. It would have to be tackled at the legal level because Kesavalame has been legalized, it is codified. Giving women, I am governed by Kesavalame, and I have felt the repercussions of Kesavalame myself in my lifetime. Even living here in Washington, D.C., it has been exercised upon me. Secondly, there would need to be this reconciliation element that I'm talking about between the Sinhalese and Tamil communities would open up many opportunities for both the Sinhalese and Tamil communities, but also the women and the youth in those communities.
We have time for one more.
I have a question. Maneshka, thank you so much. It reminded me of the similar study I did with the Naka women underground, and it just took me back. And I think the kind of findings that you brought here, being a Tamil itself, you had the rich, data that which none of us could have gone and get it. And I really appreciate the kind of journey that you must have walked through. My question is more towards you spoken about non-violence. I'm not trying to say that LTTE using violence is the legitimate tool. Now when we look back, the world, like the global itself, has become much more interconnected. And when something happens, like in Sri Lanka right now, Americans can see it, but in 1950s it wasn't possible, and that was the similar thing that we went through. And I see what the people were pushed to the periphery, where, and I mean, this is my question, if they hadn't used arms to protect themselves, would have they come this far when the government itself was, just killing thousands of people, and the world didn't know about it? It's just recently, like, when lots of violence have taken place, it has reached to a certain level where people come to an understanding that, look, there's something going on. So, yeah.
Thank you, Simila, for that question. I alluded to the Bandaranaike-Cheldenaigan Pact that was signed in 1957 as a result of nonviolent movement in Sri Lanka, specifically based on satyagraha. And so there were, despite a lack of globalization at that time in Sri Lanka specifically, there was significant movement towards structural change. And yes, it was often crowded by the violence upon the Tamil people, upon the minorities. But violence is not always the only option. There were other options for change, and the Tamil women, the mothers, the wives, the daughters, they paid the price. They paid the ultimate price, some of them. Similarly, on the other side, the Sinhalese paid the price too. So the question is, was that worth it? And for me, one life is too much to spare. I mean, the blood that has been shed on that island, really, taking John Richardson's words here, that paradise was poisoned.
Yeah, I think you posed a very interesting point, Simila. You said, without the violence, would we have come this far? And my question to you would be, after hundreds of thousands dead, how far have we come? So, traditionally now the committee will retire. Not in literal sense. It is late now.
That would be nice.
The committee will retire, so I invite you, if you have more informal questions, to pose them, and then we will confer and we shall return.